I'm Kirti Shenoy, and this is Great Work, the podcast where we talk to the people building the pipes and platforms that power the real economy. From workforce marketplaces to payroll infrastructure, staffing isn't just about jobs. It's about systems. Behind every shift filled, every onboarding flow, and every "you're hired" notification, there's someone scaling the tech and the operations to make it happen. On Great Work, we sit down with the founders and the operators who have done exactly that. Today's guest is Gino Rooney, someone who's been on the front lines of modern staffing tech for nearly a decade. He co-founded BlueCrew, one of the first platforms to go all in on W-2 employment for hourly work. At a time when 1099 was the norm, BlueCrew built the infrastructure, from compliance to scheduling, to scale light industrial staffing the right way. That company was acquired by EmployBridge, one of the largest staffing companies in the United States, in 2022. Now, Gino's back with Classet, a recruiting platform focused on the skilled trades. He rethinks about how candidate experience will actually work when the resume doesn't say it all. On today's conversation, Gino's going to share stories from building BlueCrew, talk a little bit about the acquisition from EmployBridge, and then go into Classet and what he's working to continue making strides in the staffing ecosystem. Let's get into it. Gino, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, super excited to be here and chat.
Awesome. Well, I'm a huge BlueCrew fan and obviously have known you for a couple of years, but let's start with what you're working on today. Tell us a little bit about what you're building at Classet and the problem that you're solving.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Classet, we're building an AI recruiting assistant to help talent acquisition teams operate more efficiently while providing a great candidate experience. Right now, our kind of core focus is at the earliest stage of the hiring funnel. So, essentially from post apply to qualify and engaged with candidates. What we see right now is that recruiting teams spend a lot of time at this part of the funnel, especially when they're dealing with high volume roles or in the frontline workforce where they get inundated with applications. So, rather than having the recruiting team deal with constantly reaching out, reviewing resumes, and going through the process of engaging with potentially like uninterested or non-responsive candidates. So what Classet does is it sits at that sort of piece of the funnel, will instantly engage candidates and allows them to conduct a contextual conversational voice interview with AI. So you had mentioned working on problems where resumes don't tell the full picture, and this actually provides a much better candidate experience because we do a lot of work in like the skilled trades and those types of roles where folks might have resumes that are 2 to 3 years out of date or they haven't touched it in a while. And giving candidates the opportunity to instantly interview and talk to someone on the other end of the phone about their skill set and communicate what their background is provides a much better candidate experience, and it saves recruiting teams a lot of time.
I talk to probably hundreds or thousands of staffing companies each and every year, and this comes up a lot. Staffing, workers that work at staffing agencies or work in these skilled trades might not have what white-collar employees have, like a LinkedIn and a resume that's perfectly formatted. So much of their work and the nuances of what they do are much subtler than that. So I think this is an awesome problem to solve. And it's great to see that you're still focused on sort of this niche in staffing, and kind of wanted to dive into that a little bit. So obviously I've been a huge fan of BlueCrew for many, many years. And, you really built BlueCrew from scratch and sold the business. So, what was the insight that actually led you into working in the staffing ecosystem, and what caused you to actually start BlueCrew? What inspired that?
Yeah. So I think there was kind of two dimensions. One was in the founding team, we had folks that had previously worked through staffing agencies before. So myself personally, throughout high school and college, I worked in a warehouse to help make, summer ends meet. And we went through a staffing agency to get that work and get paid and all of that. And I'd be working alongside folks that were juggling sometimes 2 to 3 different jobs and learning more about the process of just how inefficient it was for them to be able to actually find work and get paid. It kind of stuck with me over the years, and I always wanted to work on something that I felt could make an impact for folks that deserved a better opportunity or better way to find and acquire work. The other dimension, another one of our founders had been on the other side of the coin, so had been working in operations centers where they were going through staffing agencies, and it just seemed like there was a lot of like paperwork and not as much technology as there should be in terms of actually posting requisitions to let folks know that you're looking for work, and then just connecting with workers as well, so you can have a good idea of who's showing up to work, what their background looks like, in a way that didn't require you to have to go back and forth with a recruiter or someone at a staffing agency.
I love that. So that's super awesome. And obviously, Blue Crew, tens of thousands of workers working across the United States, a very, very successful company that ended up getting acquired by a very large staffing company. What was the moment that you had while building Blue Crew where you really realized, hey, we're working on something pretty cool that is working and scaling and really seems to be sustainable? So, what was that moment for you when you were building Blue Crew where you felt that way?
Yeah, reflecting back, it's hard to say if there was like a singular moment. I think maybe one of the times where we saw some momentum and I was like, wow, this is actually saving people a lot of time and doing a really good job connecting with folks was um in the early days. So we were based out of the Bay Area, and some of our earliest customers were all the different like stadiums and like hospitality events. And these are events where you need to find 100 to 200 folks on really short notice. A pretty like good use case to introduce some technology that's better at matching and getting people lined up for shifts and helping kind of collect their hours and just eliminate a lot of the paperwork involved that adds kind of time and inefficiency to such a short shift with so many people. So I think maybe the first or second of the like ballpark games that we staffed where it was 100 folks, and being able to just see how quickly our platform would fill those roles, we would just kind of sit back and ask ourselves like, how did people do this manually? How are people currently going through and calling all these resumes and finding folks that are interested and getting them placed on jobs? Because those types of jobs you need to fill 2 to 3 days notice. And it was just a good kind of aha moment for us that like, wow, technology really can help when it comes to getting people placed to work faster, especially in these types of roles.
You build this app and you build the process, but nothing is better than actually seeing that hundreds of workers showed up on time and were able to be deployed and do the work that they said that they were going to do. It's pretty magical. That entire process can almost be facilitated through technology and with the help of technology. And I agree with you, there's nothing like seeing real human beings show up at a place and do the work, and knowing that you were a part of placing them there. So that's super, super awesome. And kind of transitioning into that, Blue Crew in particular, obviously you guys have done so much in so many different sectors to innovate, and, we're one of the early sort of gig style staffing companies in the market. But something that I really love about Blue Crew is you were also one of the first gig slash tech forward platforms that really decided to adopt a W-2 model. And I think if I'm not mistaken, you guys were 100% W-2, for a phase of the company as well. The giant gig companies like the Uber and DoorDashes of the world, they're all 1099. That's kind of the way that the industry, or at least the tech forward industry, thought of gig style work, but you decided to take a W-2 approach. So could you walk us through, why did Blue Crew decide to embrace that W-2 model, and how did you do it? How did you do it when there wasn't really a playbook on how to do W-2 in this style of work?
Yeah, so I'd say there wasn't really a precedent for doing it in like a super tech forward way. Although when you look at the staffing industry as a whole, this is something that they've been doing for a very long time. And when we decided to go W-2 from the beginning and throughout our whole history, we never really offered 1099 work as an option. There's like two reasons I would say primarily. First, trying to do right by the people on our platform and workers. We had folks that were working overtime. We felt like they should be getting overtime. They also should be protected with workers' compensation and not having to find their own insurance outside of working on our platform. So a little bit of a virtuous decision of just like wanting to do right by the folks on our platform. But there was also a real just sort of compliance and sales angle to it too, which is it's very difficult to work with larger enterprises if you're going to be telling them you're sending tens into their warehouse to work alongside W-2s doing the same exact work. So we saw pretty quickly that if we didn't have a W-2 offering from our initial conversations before we even built Blue Crew, that it probably was going to silo us to only working with specific customers that are comfortable taking on the risk of potentially, misclassifying their workforce as 1099s, because I mean, we also launched in California where the rules are probably the most stringent from the employment side of things. So for us, it was a pretty conscious decision, both on the worker side doing right by them, and then also making sure that employers were comfortable using a new product like ours from a compliance and risk perspective.
It's awesome that you guys cared about overtime and the minimum wage and making sure that workers were paid fairly and accurately, which is awesome. But to your point, launching two could really be that revenue driver for your company. At the end of the day, we're all businesses and we're all trying to make revenue. And this comes up time and time again. When I get approached by customers that are maybe only in the 1099 model, they're typically approaching me with, hey, Kirti, we want to close this really large client. And this really large client requires us to have W-2 workers because they want the workers to be insured. They don't want a political scandal that these workers were contractors and they didn't get health insurance. They want to know that they're partnering with a company that's going to take care of that compliance burden, and they don't want to partner with companies that maybe don't have at least an offering for that W-2 model. So I love that point, which is it's great to give the workers overtime and the minimum wage and maybe the health insurance benefits so you feel good about, the work that you are doing, but also W-2 can be a really great revenue driver that helps you to close even larger clients and get into those deals. And to your point, traditional staffing companies, I mean, there's like 4,000 traditional staffing companies, and most staffing companies are W-2 or primarily have a W-2 style work, but really in the gig tech-enabled ecosystem, we're starting to see that they are maybe like 1099 forward, but now inching towards W-2 when they're fighting for the same contracts where they're head-to-head with those legacy staffing companies.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It certainly is easier to go to market with a 1099 model, which is, I believe, why a lot of folks in their kind of early startup days went with the 1099 forward offering. And you can definitely work with customers and get a good customer base from doing that. As you mentioned, like larger companies, as you get in, want to know that they're being protected just as well as the workers are being protected when it comes to following employment law.
Absolutely, absolutely. And kind of thinking about the labor marketplace, obviously, any labor marketplace and staffing company, it's all about supply and demand, right? You want to get more and more of these clients that want to utilize your platform to find workers. And then you also need to control the supply side, which is the workers that are actually going to show up, whether it's to that concert venue or to that warehouse to do that particular style of work. So in your case with BlueCrew and when you were scaling out that company, what was harder for you? Was it the supply side or the demand side?
I would say finding demand was sort of our go-to-market strategy, and then following up with supply afterwards. There certainly were, exceptions where finding supply would be very difficult. I think back to a couple of customers that we had in like Lancaster, Pennsylvania. That's like a very rural area where like acquiring workers is not very easy and acquiring folks on the platform. But primarily, our go-to-market was predicated around, finding great partners, finding good demand, and then launching like satellite markets with them when they wanted to expand us into other regions.
Totally makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, did you guys also do beyond entertainment staffing, like workers that were working hospitality shifts or working at concert venues? Did you guys also do some work in light industrials?
Oh yeah, that was probably 70% of our business was in kind of distribution centers, logistics, 3PLs, like those sorts of production associates, those types of roles. So pretty heavy presence in the light industrial space. So much so that a fair amount of our like sales efforts were targeted towards like, we'd go to like industrial parks and go like knocking door to door and just like talking to them about BlueCrew. We even at one point had an Airstream that was BlueCrew branded that we would post up outside of like industrial parks and talk to folks. So yeah, a lot of our business was in that sort of warehousing sector.
I love that. Well, let's talk about light industrials as a market sector in particular, because we work with light industrial companies from, all aspects of the spectrum. Some are more tech enabled, others are printing and distributing checks on the floor to all of these workers. So what were the nuances of maybe entering the light industrials world, a world where maybe the employers and even the employees were expecting things to be like very, very manual, like manual onboarding where you're pen and paper filling out your onboarding documents and you're waiting in line to pick up the check at the end of the week. How did you navigate that when you were launching BlueCrew, which is of course a more tech forward, tech enabled way of servicing those users? So could you walk us through a couple stories from that?
Yeah, so I mean, in the earliest days, within the first year of launching, our onboarding process probably could have been even more tech enabled than it was. So we were, you had mentioned kind of filling out the paperwork in person and things like that. We would moonlight as recruiters and onboarders. So we would essentially like rent out different like conference spaces across the Bay Area, and we would host onboarding sessions where we would go through and explain our platform, take people through like the paperwork that they needed to fill out, and get them all set up for whether it was direct deposit or payment by check and whatever that might be. Over time, we made that a lot more automated of a process. Certainly during COVID, some things changed too, where nine verification, you were allowed to do it remotely for a bit. So that definitely helped. But we always had some local presences in the markets that we went to. In the light industrial space specifically, I think one area where folks potentially like expect a little bit more, call it white glove or sort of manual efforts, was at some of the large distribution centers. Staffing agencies will have floor managers or folks that are like on-site reps and things like that, just to help troubleshoot questions. And I do think that's like a really important relationship building angle for a lot of the agencies to offer. So that was something that we eventually started to do with some of our larger customers, was offering them on-site folks. But to the point about like delivering payroll and things like that, we always had it either direct deposit or we'd be mailing out checks. And eventually we had like daily pay and all of that stuff too, which I think is really awesome for like the light industrial workforce, because a lot of folks are working paycheck to paycheck, and being able to pull down, daily pay early is a big win for them.
I love that. If I were to summarize what you said, at least for your enterprise customers, maybe offering them a little bit more of a customized approach of, hey, we'll have people on site kind of walking the workers through onboarding if this is net new for you, just to make sure that you're comfortable with that process. And then B, the incentive on the worker side is, hey, maybe you were used to getting paid once a week or every other week with a physical paycheck, but we want to do better than that. We want to help you embrace technology, and you're going to get rewarded for embracing the technology because you're going to get paid faster and faster. So I love those sort of insights. And it's kind of an interesting challenge. There are traditional companies in warehousing that want to partner with staffing companies, but maybe are worried about embracing the tech forward approach. And then there's also staffing companies that are also afraid for the same reasons. They want to bring their onboarding to a digital process. They want to bring payments to a digital process, but they're sort of fearful of switching up that process and switching up what they've done for decades. So, any other words of wisdom that you would provide to, both companies embracing tech forward staffing companies and then staffing companies that want to embrace being more tech forward? What advice do you have for them for, maybe taking that leap or considering to take the leap to digitize more of their systems?
Yeah, I think the best way you can do it is sort of one step at a time, and maybe starting with the angle of, staffing agencies that are looking to embrace more technology. I think really analyzing your recruiting and hiring funnel and your customer relationships, and looking for opportunities where they would be open for a more digital onboarding experience, or even at like the top of the funnel where we focus at with Classet, we view that as like a very highly leverageable spot to put technology in play to drive a better candidate experience and save your team some time. I do think there are some areas though where having, customer relationship or letting the workers be able to talk to someone is important. Like when it comes to like payroll or like payment related things, when you think about the light industrial space, in a lot of ways, you're almost acting as a bank for the folks that are out working, because a lot of their savings is tied up into the work that they're doing. So if you don't provide them with an opportunity to actually like talk to someone or get someone on the phone when they're having trouble, like it is a degraded customer experience. My advice for the staffing agencies that we're looking at adding technology, I would probably focus in areas where you feel like you can get the most operating leverage from without, sacrificing, important candidate experience moments along the way of them working with you, because that really does drive better retention, is if folks feel like they're part of your team and that they can talk to someone if there's an important issue. On the employer side, I'd actually say like technology is becoming somewhat like table stakes in the light industrial space for working with large employers that are hiring large amounts of hourly workers, because ultimately it is an efficiency driver. And if the employer is looking for the most efficient and cheapest hiring technologies out there, there's a chance that that staffing agency might get left behind if they're not able to really service that account as fast and quickly and as efficiently as others are able to in the market. I do think a lot more employers, though, are becoming more and more open. I think when we first started BlueCrew, it was a lot of getting people into mobile apps, or like just having like a online staffing platform was sort of like the buzzword at the time. And over the last 10 years, it seems like a lot of companies and even the large staffing agencies have their own online platform offerings. So I do think there's not much of a barrier anymore for employers that are like thinking about getting started, trying to use a more tech-enabled solution, just because there's a lot of them out there, whether it's, startups or, big agencies that have deployed technology on their side of the house.
Yeah, I totally see that change. More and more staffing companies, at least for one side of their department, might be experimenting with those more online tech forward efforts. And we're starting to see this in the market as well. Staffing companies taking maybe an acquired entity, a company that they've acquired, and then just saying, hey, this is going to be our tech enabled arm and our little guinea pig
Mhm.
experiment where we're going to go with the upgraded recruiting tools and the upgraded onboarding tools and the upgraded payroll tools. And we're going to see if this is sustainable, because if this is sustainable and this works, we need to bring it across the rest of the organization. But yeah, don't be afraid to experiment with guinea pig sub company that you own, because it could be the thing that helps you to win more deals and helps you to totally revamp the entire org. Obviously, you built Blue Crew, put your blood, sweat, and tears into that company, and then ended up having a very successful acquisition with EmployBridge, which is one of the largest staffing companies in the United States, which is awesome. So what did it take for you to scale Blue Crew into a place where EmployBridge could actually acquire that? And what are your tips for staffing builders that want to build a big business, but maybe want to build a business that could get acquired by another giant and make an impact there? So any thoughts or feelings or stories that you have on that journey for the EmployBridge acquisition?
Yeah, I think really trying to focus on building where you think the target is going, not where it's at, is pretty important. Like what you'd mentioned, just like the W-2 model and being kind of one of first to markets with that. We knew that that was something that these large staffing agencies, they already have a W-2 offering, but they're going to need to figure out how to offer something like that in a much more tech forward way. So that was certainly sort of part of our kind of go to market plan, was building where we believe the industry is heading and where it needs to go, which certainly as you're a builder of staffing solutions, thinking through those sort of things and trying to build towards that moving target where you believe it's going to be is important. As we scaled our business, we were a team of 8 for the first 2 or 3 years, and we really focus on just being kind of lean, mean, and making sure that we can kind of prove out that, the unit economics of this model do work before we scaled it out. Certainly in the staffing space, there are large profitable businesses built in the staffing space. So we always knew that that was something that we should keep our eye on, and we shouldn't just, spend a bunch of money to spend a bunch of money and grow really quickly when we know there is like the opportunity to just build like a really, really awesome staffing solution in this space. So I think moving at the right pace is really important, and a lot of times like your customers will help kind of push you in the direction of how fast you should be moving as a builder. And then as we continued to grow, so when we went from a team of 8 all the way up to, I think at the peak we were maybe at 100 120, really looking for opportunities as you continue to grow to leverage more operational efficiency. Staffing is a very operationally heavy business, and it needs to be, because there's a real function of customer service in staffing, and it's really, really important to have good relationships with your clients and be able to offer them, a white glove service when they deserve a white glove service for all they're doing for you too. So I think just looking for kind of operational wins along the way to make sure that you're giving your customers exactly what they need, but you're also not growing your company way too big and burning way too much cash, I think is important too, to just keep an eye on the longer term, like operating leverage that you have as you're building your business.
Absolutely. I love it. You and I were in Y Combinator, and a phrase that gets said a lot is don't die. Stay in the
Mhm.
game, keep scaling your business, and whether you're bootstrapping or you're VC backed, it's a business is a business, and it's don't die, continue scaling, be mindful of your expenses, but also keep growing. And to your point, I think staffing companies, especially staffing companies that are growing, whether you're in the early stages of 1 to 10 million in revenue, or even beyond that kind of phase, embracing technology and doing things the right way might be your win and your entry point to getting acquired by a larger staffing company, right? Because these larger staffing companies, they want to experiment with tech and they don't know how to do it. So sometimes acquiring the right company that already has those processes, those really awesome operational processes, and those tech products in place can be a great, again, guinea pig for them. So embracing technology, embracing making those operational improvements for the company that you have could be your ticket into getting acquired by a really large company. So I really love that insight. We spent a lot of time talking about Blue Crew and your journey there. So thanks so much for sharing, those stories and words of wisdom there. But let's bring it back to Classet. Right now you've decided to stay in the staffing industry. So I think you like this space and have more that you want to do for this space, which I love. But let's talk about Classet. So you guys are focusing on really revolutionizing recruiting. What part of the hiring process in particular do you think is broken and needs a serious revamp in the staffing ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to my point a minute ago about just like trying to create operating leverage as you're continuing to grow, whether it's a staffing organization or any hiring organization and talent acquisition operation. We saw this when we were scaling up BlueCrew was it pretty often needed to hire more and more folks to just help with taking candidates that had expressed interest or raised their hand for some position and making sure that they were interested, going to show up, qualified, and wanting to be put forward in front of a customer to go to show up for work. So that's really where Classet is focused on helping create more efficiency for talent acquisition teams. It's the point of application all the way to qualifying and getting that candidate in front of whether it's a hiring manager or the end employer. So the way that that currently works is, let's take you as an example. You apply to a role. We're working with a customer. We typically embed into their applicant tracking system or whatever their hiring workflows are. As soon as our recruiting assistant, we call her Joy, sees your application come through. If it looks qualified, Joy will reach out to you and say, hey, thank you so much for applying. We use an AI-based recruiting assistant to help speed up our hiring process and meet you where you're at. Do you have any questions, and do you have any time to talk? That process is all automated, and we'll also re-engage the candidate because we saw this at BlueCrew that a lot of folks don't respond to the first message you sent them. So you need to really treat it like a sales funnel. And then once the candidate's interested in looking to move forward, it'll automatically, shoot an outbound call to them, or they can do it over a web call and just conduct a completely autonomous AI-driven phone interview, which is heavily customizable by the end employer. And what it really helps do is just remove a lot of the friction involved with going from this massive amount of applications that you get on the job boards these days to, hey, here's a list of folks that have raised their hand, talked about their skill set, meet the requisite criteria, and are looking to move forward with work. And we saw at BlueCrew that that was where a lot of time was being spent, just manually having to reach out to folks and actually do that qualification process.
I think this comes up a lot with the staffing companies I talk to, and I think the most successful staffing companies are ones that actually care about the workers consenting to the work that they're signing up for, right? When a worker actually wants to do a particular assignment, they bring a totally different energy to workplace. They're excited to do the work, they wanted to do the work, and they're so excited because the staffing company actually cared about the style of work that they wanted to do and wanted to connect them to those opportunities. So I think the more that we can create those magical moments where staffing companies are really placing those workers in workplaces that they're excited to be in, the better outcomes that we can really produce for not only the staffing company, but especially their clients and also the workers, which is awesome. And this wouldn't be a podcast without me having to mention a little bit about something around AI and staffing. And, staffing companies want to embrace AI and sometimes can be confused as to where to start. So can you talk about how Classet is kind of helping staffing companies to utilize more AI to be more efficient? Could you walk us through how Classet's doing that?
Yeah, so we work with a fair amount of staffing agencies. We also are direct to employer as well. So we have customers in the end employer space too. But our kind of core philosophy is think about leveraging Classet as if you were going to hire your own recruiting assistant. So what that means for us is like we need to be able to operate inside of their current hiring system. We don't want to create a situation where they're having to leverage multiple tools to get stuff done, or where they're having to potentially migrate from one applicant tracking system to another just to work with us. So that's typically how we work, and we really sit at that initial point of the funnel to really help them with that qualification process too. One of the stats that we saw looking at some of the application data on our platform that I think is like obvious, but also like really important for people to understand is that 60% of candidates apply to jobs outside of business hours. So when you think about that at your staffing agency, if you're not running a 24/7 desk, you could be losing a lot of candidates because you're not able to get to them in time. And part of having, an AI recruiting assistant in your system, you can even start small. Use it for off-hour support so that candidates can get in touch with your business when they are where they are. And we saw this at BlueCrew too, where it's very common for folks to have a lot of questions about a role before they decide if they want to move forward, or not entirely. You mentioned making sure the candidate wants to work there. Like that's an important piece of it too. If you're taking, 4 or 5 days to get back to someone just to understand if they're interested in a role, the odds are that they've found somewhere else to work already. So that's really kind of where we focus. And in terms of like helping companies leverage AI, we are pretty hands-on just because, especially in the staffing space, every use case is slightly different. So we do work pretty closely with customers to make sure that our solution is pretty tailored to their existing hiring workflow and, actions candidates into the places that they want them actioned based on the outcomes of the interactions with the AI recruiting assistant. So I could totally see from the perspective of a potential staffing agency that there is just like so much AI noise out there and so many different like tools you can plug into your workflow. I think my advice would be, first look at your hiring stack and try to identify like where are we spending the most amount of human hours dealing with problems that we feel like could be automated or are highly repetitive. And I say this coming from a place of like, I fully believe that recruiters are really, really important for staffing agencies, for the hiring ecosystem. Where I believe that it's heading is recruiters becoming more and more sort of like helping with like the last mile logistics of getting people really excited about the role, the speaking about like the culture of the companies that they're going to be working at and freeing them up from a lot of the like monotonous top of funnel work. So when the staffing agencies thinking about leveraging AI, what I would recommend is just take like a holistic view of your hiring stack, look for areas where you feel like there's a lot of repetitive administrative work going on, and then try to identify solutions that can help solve that because more and more solutions are popping up every single day.
That's awesome. AI can work after hours and help, answer the questions for the workers to make sure that by the time you're awake and back to work and at your desk, the worker is closer and closer to accepting that role. So I really love that insight. And I guess to kind of wrap up, this portion of the podcast before we move into the rapid fire, Gino, I'd love to know what is something that you used to believe in staffing or the industry in general that you no longer believe after working in the industry for 10 plus years?
Um, I think one thing, there's probably two things. One thing that I used to believe but no longer believe, and then maybe one thing that I have a newfound respect for. So the first one is when we started BlueCrew, I believe that there was an opportunity to automate 99% of what a staffing agency does. Mm, And maybe that was just being like a little bit too rosy-eyed, but kind of going back to some of the early conversations, like customer service is a competitive advantage in the staffing world. And understanding how you can free up your team to focus more on the important customer service checkpoints versus them doing like kind of repetitive administrative work that doesn't provide you with that operating leverage is kind of the name of the game. So I think that's one thing maybe I don't believe anymore is like you can have like a completely autonomous staffing agency because I do think there is a really real component to having customer service as a competitive advantage. The sort of newfound respect thing, I don't know that there was ever not respect, but staffing agencies are hard. It is a full stack business. Everything from dealing with onboarding compliantly, payrolling, time tracking, offboarding, compliance, like workers' comp. Like it is very much a full stack business. It is, yeah, I have a lot of respect for folks that are building staffing agencies because you really do get you're just solving so many problems in so many different like departments or areas of company building.
I could not agree more with you, Gino. I think to your point, it's so important for staffing companies to spend their time in the right places. Spend your time thinking about how you're going to grow your business, how you're going to continue to reconnect with the workers that are on your platform, and then partner up with providers or try to really reflect on how you can automate that end-to-end process of how you're going to do everything from onboarding, payroll, workers comp, recruiting, reporting, invoicing. I mean, those are a lot of things that a staffing company has to get right. So it's really about, spending your time on the right things, which is growing the business and keeping workers happy and working with the right type of software providers that can really listen and help you to automate those flows. And then also maybe help you out also with a bit of that customer service piece, making sure that workers are getting paid and that they could reprocess their payments or making sure that workers could get their questions answered in the case of classes. For the final portion of the podcast, I would love to run through just some rapid fire questions. So, Gino, I'm going to hit you with them. So first off, what is the craziest staffing or recruiting challenge that you've ever had to solve?
I think it would probably go back to some of those like stadium jobs where we needed to come up with, this was in the early days when we needed to come up with, fill a job of 200 folks within like, 24 to 48 hours notice. It definitely required, there were weekends where we were just, holed up in an apartment, just smiling and dialing as much as we could, doing anything manual or programmatic that we could do to try to fill roles. Then certainly a fair share of just, what I would call like unfortunate moments that happen when you're in the staffing world where, a candidate behaves in a way that you hope they wouldn't have behaved. Yeah, I feel like there's probably a coffee table book that we could fill up with stories from that. But it was also a great learning that, those types of things happen in staffing, and how you respond to them and how you provide support throughout that process is a potential differentiator for customer relationship building.
I love that. And what's the best piece of advice that you've ever received as a founder and business owner?
Yeah, I think a lot of the guidance that YC gave us when we went through YC was really, really helpful. They really push you towards trying to grow and get revenue and work with customers as quickly as you can, because once you have paying customers, that's when there's something at stake and you get a lot of really good feedback, and it pushes you to kind of build your product in the right ways. I think the advice to just really try to grow fast and push and try to get paying customers was really important in the early days for us. And then I think as we grew up the company, I don't know who this would be attributed to, but I remember reading some quote or hearing some mantra around like nothing is ever as good as it seems and nothing is ever as bad as it seems, which in both the startup world and the staffing world, I feel like has helped us to just keep like sort of like an even keel mentality, because we just know, staffing can be cyclical. Things can happen that are out of your control. And in the same way, you can have something really good happen that doesn't end up as good as you think it might. You can have something really bad happen, and that's an opportunity for your team to rally around and improve from. So I think just that sort of mantra has helped us like remain sort of even keel throughout our startup journeys.
Love it. And then last question. Our podcast is called Great Work. What do you think great work means to you?
Yeah, I think great work is the output of what happens when you have a group of folks that are highly motivated by the problem that they're solving and very closely um, in tune with the users that they're going to be solving that problem for. It's, great work creates operating leverage, it creates momentum, and it also, I think there's certainly sort of like the blocking and tackling work that can be great work. But when I think about great work, it's things that create operating leverage and create a great, the mantra from YC of make something people want. To me, that's what great work is, when you make something that people want.
I love it. Well, Gino, thank you so much for your time today. I had so much fun diving into the throwbacks of Blue Crew, and congratulations on all the work that you've done with Classet. I'm so happy that we have these amazing operators in our space that have built for staffing and really know what they're doing. So congratulations on all that you've done, and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, sure thing. It was fun.